Okay, so now that we looked at what the literature slash mythology has to tell us, what I want to do now is take a look at what the archaeology is telling us. And if you remember that the first slide from the previous video was giving the list of the Latial phases, or the different time periods in Latin history or Roman history. Just a little bit about Latial phase number 1, which is about 1000 to about 900 BC. What you're looking at on this map is a list, or not a list, showing you the 7 hills of Rome. So I'm not going to count them for you, but you can see, like, here's the Aventine, the Palatine, Capitoline, and so on. So the 7 hills of Rome. And based on archaeology, it looks like certainly by the 900s BC, these were being lived around and lived in. We do know that this area here, let me just see if I can make a circle here, was low-lying, very low-lying, and very marshy. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that you've got rain runoff from these hills. And of course, the other one is that you have the Tiber River. And this river floods like most rivers. And when it floods, it starts penetrating into this particular area. So it's marshy, probably not a lot of people living in this area, even though if you look at most books, they always talk about the huts of Rome, where what will eventually become the Forum is. And I've given you an article to read about the early development of the Roman Forum, so make sure you read that because it's got some interesting material in there about some possibilities of what's going on in this particular area. Still in Latial Phase 1, we definitely have burial sites from this area. Now, I've already mentioned grave goods. A grave good is anything in a grave that's not the body. So like pottery, weapons, and so on. One way that archaeologists use to figure out the time periods in a site. So if you imagine taking a cross section of land, I'm going to try and draw this. I don't know how this is going to work, but say this is ground level. Archaeologists will take a slice of the ground, and what they see is layers of material. And so say there's some pottery here and, you know, a skeleton here. What seriation does is it helps us to figure out what the dates are of these particular levels. Now, the problem with land is that it's not level. So you might get a hill over here, and you still have layers of material. Now, what might be happening here is that this particular layer here, which looks higher, is actually this lower level here. And so what seriation does, again, is it helps us to determine these different layers just by looking at the material that might be found here with, say, material found here. And if you can date something, then you can start numbering these particular layers. Now, of course, you always have to think about what can archaeology and burial sites tell us about Roman civilization. Well, it can tell us about a lot about burial practices. So either people are cremated, or there's that inhumation, which is the burying of the entire body. There are grave goods, so it can tell you maybe the social status of the person being buried. Tell you some other things. Now, what it can't tell us everything about society, because not everything is buried with the body. You might get more burials of men early on as opposed to women, and so it doesn't tell you a lot about women during this particular time. And so just be aware of what it can and can't tell us in terms of archaeology. I already mentioned these hut urns that were found with the Etruscans, and it looks like the Romans took over this particular practice. And again, if you remember, these hut urns are where human remains were put, usually after cremation, so that the ashes were put in these urns. They were then put in something else and then buried. So you definitely find these. Now, if you look here, what I've given you is some information about this particular hut urn. It is from the Latial Phase II-A, 900 to 850 BC. It gives you what it's made out of ceramic, and the height. And then all of these archaeological remains have catalog numbers so that you can easily look these things up later. Now, when you move on to Latial Phase II, so about 900 to 770 BC, you see some definite changes going on. And some of these things will make sense if you start thinking about it in terms of the archaeology. So you've got more grave sites. So what that's probably indicating, and it certainly is that there are more people, more grave sites. And then what you also see is the number of grave goods going up. So the number of physical material left in a grave site. What that could be telling you is that the economy is doing better because there's more things available to actually bury with people. Settlements are getting larger, and that, of course, is directly related probably to the more grave sites. So population levels are going up. The decoration of pottery starts going up. So that's also telling you more than just a piece of pottery that's decorated. It's telling you that maybe the economy is going fine, people are able to eat, and they have time to actually decorate their pottery. I mentioned this before, that around this particular phase 2, 900 to 770 BC, you have more bodies being buried as opposed to cremation. You also you start to find what might be called elite burials, people buried with lots of wealth. And of course, that can tell you a little bit about the society and the social levels of these people living in this particular period. And you also find that burials are being moved from the forum to other areas. I've got a question here. What do these changes suggest? Some of this I've answered as I've talked about each individual point. In terms of burials being moved by the forum, some scholars have said, well, maybe the forum is becoming more important to the Roman people as a gathering place, maybe where some religious buildings are being built, and they don't want people being buried in that particular area. So that's at least a few things of what these suggest. There's lots more explanations of what might possibly be going on during this period. A very famous sort of archaeological site is called the House of Romulus. So we talked about Romulus when we talked about the early literature, or the literature of this early period. There is sort of a cave that could have possibly been a house, and it's been called the House of Romulus because it's fairly early, that it's been dated to 800 to 750. And the traditional date of the founding of the city is about 750 something BC. I've given you the sizes here of this. So it's about 5 meters, so 15 feet by, we'll say 4 meters, 12 feet. I'll give you an article in Blackboard about this particular house. Now, this particular article or archaeological site is interesting because it's been sort of worshipped by the Romans for a very long time. There's been a number of fires in this particular building because it looks like what they're doing is they're bringing in things like incense and things that they would burn and sacrifice, and of course that sets off fires and so on. So it's been remodeled in a number of different times. So there's actually quite a bit of scholarship on this, and whether it really is the House of Romulus, that's a totally different question. Moving on to Latial Phase III, and I've given you the dates, and 4A. So these time periods can be broken up into smaller and smaller bits based on what archaeology is telling us. You may be, excuse me, seeing some interaction with the Greeks now based on pottery. Now, this is really important to remember. This is being questioned by a number of different scholars on whether there's direct contact with the Greeks or if there's just an influx of Greek pottery, say, into the south where the Greeks are certainly living, making its way up to the Etruscans, and then they're trading it with the Romans. So it doesn't necessarily have to, just because the pottery's there, doesn't necessarily have to mean that they were in direct contact with the Greeks. So that's what you need to remember about this. We do find the archaeological remains of a wall. probably put up sometime in the 700s BC. And if you remember the story I told you about Romulus and Remus and the fight they get into over this wall, maybe this is an indication of something that the literature is telling us. You do find, and I mentioned this before, grave sites with expensive remains, but about 600 BC, these are becoming rarer. Now, a big question is why? Why would you have a number of grave sites increasing in Latial Phase 1 and 2 and then decreasing in 3? It's possible, like one of the explanations could be that the Romans are starting to put more of their economic output into building religious buildings and temples, because you certainly see that coming up a little bit later. So maybe they're not so interested in bearing wealth with people. Instead, they're plowing their wealth into their religious buildings or their civic buildings. Archaeology, in terms of what's happening in the 600s and the late 500s, this is about the time of the story I was telling you about with the getting rid of the kings, the 509 BC, so that's around this particular time. We know from archaeology, and this is in the article that I'm having you read, the forum itself, so that area in between those two hills was raised. So, and that's partly done because it's a wet area, probably dangerous to live in because of the wet conditions, the Tiber floods, and so on. And it looks like it was this massive effort to raise the floor of the forum. And this is not only telling you, that, okay, well, there's a fact, so you've raised the forum. It's telling you about organization of the state too, because this isn't something that just a few people could do. This is going to take a large number of people working for a common cause. Once they raised it, it was paved with pebbles. And then what you also find is religious/political areas were being marked out with an area called the Pomerium. And this was sort of this sacred boundary centering around the forum and around what will become the city of Rome. And there were specific laws about what could happen within this boundary. For example, armed soldiers were not allowed to come in to the Pomerium, this sacred line. So they had to leave their weapons and then come in. You also see something called votive deposits. These are statues, like little religious statues that are created to honor the gods and goddesses. You start to see these found more and more. And then one thing that was definitely related to the lifting up of the floor of the forum is the creation of a drainage system. The main one is called the Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Sewer. And it was really designed to help with flooding. So I told you that, the whole area between these hills floods because water comes down from the hills when it rains, and then you got the flooding of the Tiber. It's thought that this sewer system would help with draining all this away, and of course draining human waste as well. And this is just draining into the Tiber, which is pretty typical. So this slide is just showing you where the Cloaca Maxima is, or where it still exists today. So it started up here, and then this, and I'll show you what the visible opening looks like today, dumps out into the Tiber. So it's collecting water, rainwater, and sewer, and then dumping it into the river. And then this is the opening of the Cloaca Maxima today. And then finally, the last piece of archaeology that I want to discuss that dates to the mid-500s is something called the lapis niger, or the black stone. This was discovered in the Forum, and it's one of the earliest inscriptions that we have or earliest evidence of writing we have, at least from a large amount of writing. And what I'm giving you here is a possible translation of this stone. And what you can see here is the stone itself with some of the writing, so early Latin. And I'm taking this from this particular book. So why don't you go ahead and turn off the video and then read through this section, and then come back and we can just discuss it a bit. Okay, so what you can see is this particular area must have been sacred, at least from the reconstruction of this stone. So whoever violates this grove, let him be cursed. Don't dump anything. Don't bury anybody. And remember, we talked about how the grave sites in this area are becoming fewer and fewer. A king. So this corresponds to the literature that we've talked about, where you've got those early kings of Rome. And this must be a time when there's a king, because they're certainly writing about it. Let it be lawful for a king to sacrifice a cow in atonement. And for everything that happens, I think this should be fined. Let him find one for each offense, or maybe it's let him fine. I'll have to check, as in money. And then it talks about let the king have a herald, walk along a route, and then unfortunately these dots here indicate that we don't know what the text actually says. It's talking about who can actually assemble in this grove or in the forum. And we've talked about how the forum is the center of Roman society. So pretty early on, and this is dating to the mid-500s BC, this was an extremely early area. And if the story is true about Romulus and not Romulus and Remus, about the rape of Lucretia, then that traditional date is 509 BC. This would put the date in with kings, and of course we can see that in the inscription.